This is Nightly Business Report with Tyler Matheson and Sue Herrera.
Rising tensions. The president leaves on a high-stakes foreign policy trip one day after North Korea tests a missile that could carry out a nuclear warhead into U.S. territory. The markets kept cool, but the next few days could provide some stern tests.
Playing defense as tensions rise around the globe, why America's defense companies may be an excellent place for some of your capital.
Looking for a mortgage? Why they could soon be easier to get for millions of Americans. Those stories and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Wednesday, July 5th.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. International tensions and anticipation ran high as investors returned to the markets today after Monday's abbreviated session and yesterday's July 4th holiday. So, how would global markets react today after news yesterday of North Korea's first ever successful launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile, one capable potentially of carrying a nuclear warhead into U.S. territory? Well, the answer, frankly, is there wasn't much reaction. Stocks, bonds, currency, and gold were largely calm today. But that could change in an instant as the week's news plays out.
Front and center, that missile launch, a test North Korea's dictator said was coming, and that President Trump derided. It won't happen, he tweeted earlier this year. But it did, just as the U.S. conducts missile tests of its own with South Korea. In a statement today, the top U.S. military commander in South Korea said the U.S. and the South are prepared to go to war with North Korea if given the order. As for efforts to enlist China to put pressure on Pyongyang, they don't seem to be bearing fruit. Mr. Trump tweeted today, quote, "Trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us. But we had to give it a try." So what's left to try?
The word solution in North Korea probably have never been mentioned in the same sentence before. The options are all pretty poor or unattractive.
The Korea conundrum playing out as the president departed for Europe and a meeting of the G20 in Hamburg, Germany later this week. There, he will come face to face for the first time with Russia's Vladimir Putin. He'll also meet with China's Xi Jinping, who himself met with Putin in Moscow Monday and Tuesday. The stakes could not be higher. Will Trump try to directly tie U.S.-China trade to Beijing's help with North Korea? What about Russia's role in Syria, Ukraine, and the U.S. elections? And then there's the delicate matter of U.S. relations with traditional European allies like France and Germany.
You've got real disagreements over trade, real disagreements over climate change, questions about America's willingness to stand up to Russia. Probably the Europeans won't be as muscular as we would like them to be when it comes to North Korea. Plus the personal dynamics between Chancellor Merkel and President Trump, shall we say, are less than ideal.
So far this year, markets have largely shrugged off global worries and put geopolitics in the back seat. But that could change, and the back seat could become a real front seat market driver.
While the broader markets were flat, one sector that did move today on the rising tensions with North Korea was the defense sector. Boeing, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin were all higher, and they're all companies behind our country's military defenses. Morgan Brennan has more.
The Pentagon is describing it as a new kind of missile that, quote, we've not seen before. An intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, tested by North Korea as America celebrated Independence Day. The ICBM flew for 37 minutes, making it the country's longest launch, before landing off the coast of Japan. While experts are skeptical of the North's ability to turn the missile into a weapon, it's the surest sign yet the rogue country is moving closer to its goal of being able to target Alaska and other parts of the U.S. But the Pentagon says it's ready, especially in light of its own recent test that successfully intercepted a mock ICBM. That system, called the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense, is a $40 billion network of radars, sensors, and rocket-propelled interceptors that can track and destroy long-range ballistic missiles in space. The only such ground-based system capable of protecting the entire U.S. from such a threat, even as its effectiveness has at times been questioned. Boeing is the prime contractor of the system, with parts made by Raytheon Orbital ATK and Aerojet Rocketdyne. But there are other missile defenses in use as well. Lockheed Martin's THAAD and Raytheon's Patriot, both ground-based, and Lockheed's Aegis, which is largely deployed on ships. All three counter regional threats and work with the Boeing system as a layered defense approach. Demand is growing, and the expectation is lawmakers will greenlight more money to develop more defenses. But all of it will take time. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Morgan Brennan.
So how should investors like you factor in geopolitical tensions, and could global flashpoints eventually start to affect investment values? Here with some insight is Paul Christopher, Global Head of the Market Strategist with the Wells Fargo Investment Institute. Mr. Christopher, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Why do you think global tensions haven't affected the markets really very much over the past year or so, and especially not this year? We've had terror events in England and elsewhere, this missile test yesterday, but the market seems to sort of roll merrily along.
That's right. Yeah, there's several reasons I can think of. One is that frankly, we've had a synchronized global economic recovery in place since the middle of last year, and investors have really just become aware of that since late last year, call it November, December. And that's been one important factor. A second is really the continued, let's say, the ongoing use of stimulative monetary policies. There's just an awful lot of liquidity sloshing around, whether it's still in the U.S. with low interest rates, in Europe and in Japan. And I think the third reason is something even more basic, and that is, with these high risk, low probabilities, or I should say high impact, low probability events, there's a strong tendency to just say, oh, well, that's just another one of those low probability events out there. And people, frankly, tend to underestimate.
Right. And is North Korea perhaps one of those events or one of those situations that they are underestimating? We had a special session of the UN today, and you have allies of the United States calling for basically stricter sanctions now on North Korea. Is that situation changing in the market's eyes or not?
I think it will, and it depends a lot. Interestingly, I think it depends less on the launch of that test missile yesterday than it does upon what the conversation looks like and sounds like between President Xi and President Trump that we're going to hear about in the next few days. That's going to be very much more important. And I think there's another risk here, and that is that there's obviously the extreme risk of some sort of nuclear or preemptive attack by the U.S., a nuclear event by the North Koreans or a preemptive by the U.S. But there's another risk here, and that is really that the U.S. and China have a bigger falling out over North Korea that puts questions on the board about trade and inter-regional cooperation.
So these are big, high-concept thoughts that you're putting out there. Bring it back to me and my portfolio, Paul, if you don't mind, quickly. How can I event-proof my portfolio, or should I even try?
Yeah, I don't think anyone can event-proof a portfolio, but here's what you can do. You can play the probabilities that are very much higher. One is that we believe the global economic recovery will continue in a synchronized way going forward. So number one, play growth. Number two, because there are so many risks out there, you mentioned Russia, the Middle East, there's even U.S. political risk here in terms of what we do with tax reform and infrastructure. Rather than try to pick one of those risks and try to insulate or inoculate your portfolio, take a diversified approach, rebalance the portfolio often, and play the growth theme. We think that by doing that, you won't necessarily catch all the risks, but you also won't be strung up by all the worst ones if you try to go the other way.
Paul, thank you very much. Paul Christopher with Wells Fargo Investment Institute.
Stocks were steady today, as we said, despite the events overseas. Technology stocks snapped a three-day losing streak, and the Federal Reserve released the minutes of its last meeting. More on that in just a second. First, the closing numbers. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was off just 1 point to 21,478. The Nasdaq rose 40, and the S&P 500 added 3. Crude prices fell sharply on reports that OPEC's oil exports rose in June, and on a separate report that Russia would not support a further extension of ongoing production cuts.
Well, the oil market will also be watching developments in the auto sector. In a statement today, Volvo said all of its new models it produces will be electric or hybrid starting in 2019. The CEO had made a similar statement back in May. According to Reuters, the decision makes Volvo the first traditional automaker to set a date to phase out conventional car engines. Volvo is owned by Geely, a Chinese company.
Auto production is carefully watched by the manufacturing sector, and today the Commerce Department reported that new orders for factory goods fell 0.8% in May, marking the second straight month of declines. Manufacturing activity accounts for more than 10% of the U.S. economy and has lost a bit of momentum as motor vehicle sales moderate.
Is there a split within the Federal Reserve? The minutes of the last meeting point to agreement on some issues important to the economy, but not on others. Hampton Pearson explains.
Minutes from the June Fed meeting show monetary policymakers divided on the outlook for inflation and its possible impact on the timing and number of future interest rate hikes. Most say inflation below the Fed's 2% target is a short-term phenomenon, due in part to things like cheaper telecom services and falling gasoline prices. But others are concerned that the lack of wage inflation in a tight labor market means inflation has slowed.
I think they're laying out the risk case that it may not be wholly transitory. So the fact that they put those caveats in while expressing comfort that things will go back to normalcy does give me some confidence that they think there's a chance we're in a different environment.
At that mid-June meeting, several monetary policymakers wanted to announce plans to start reducing the Fed's $4 trillion portfolio of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. But there was no consensus on exactly when to start. Fed watchers, however, say markets are prepared and the economy is strong enough to withstand the Fed's key policy moves.
I think it's going to be modestly felt initially, but long term, ultimately, the Fed is going to be the dictator of where rates go. Clearly, we need some good data to back it up, and we need some inflation to come back. If that doesn't happen, I think rates stay low.
So those June minutes suggest inflation is really the X factor for future rate hikes. And as far as normalizing the balance sheet, it all comes down to timing, with late September the most likely kickoff. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Hampton Pearson in Washington.
Coming up, why mortgage hunting is getting a little bit easier. If you are shopping for a home, you may be in luck. We told you last week about some credit scoring changes that could help borrowers, potentially making it easier to get a home loan. But there are some risks, as always. Diana Olick explains.
Just over a decade ago, big lenders were giving big mortgages to anyone with a pulse. And this is what happened. Today, it's much harder to get a home loan, but that has sidelined some worthy borrowers. So the vice is now loosening yet again. Two major changes in underwriting go into effect this month. First, the nation's credit rating agencies are dropping tax liens and civil judgments from consumers' profiles if they're not fully documented. That's because 1 in 5 consumers have mistakes on their credit reports. Of about 220 million Americans with a credit profile, about 7% have these credit hits. Without them, their FICO credit scores could go up by as much as 20 points. Second, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are increasing the amount of debt payments a borrower can have compared to their income, from 45% to 50% of pre-tax income. That is a response to today's high level of student loan debt.
We're not changing the other underwriting criteria, and we believe that the additional increment of risk from making that change is very small. And given how pristine credit has been post-crisis, we don't feel like that's an unreasonable risk to take.
But it does mean some consumers will be saddled with even more debt.
I think the main concern that I have is the fact that you have these multiple issues coming together. You have more stretched consumers. You have potentially consumers that have demonstrated credit problems in the past.
Brown says consumers who've had a tax lien or civil judgment are from 2 to 5 times more likely to be late on a payment again.
It doesn't really do a consumer well to be extended credit that they can't afford, they can't reasonably service.
But debt limits and credit scores are not the only thing lenders consider.
We look at all the other criteria for that are information rich, in terms of assessing that individual's risk profile, and they have to look good in all those other areas.
And the lending market itself isn't changing its appetite for overall risk and potential losses. So while it may loosen up in some areas of credit, it may also tighten in others. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Diana Olick in Washington.
While it may appear to be easier to get a mortgage due to those new credit score changes, credit card defaults are rising, even as the economy is on solid footing. So what does this suggest about the health of consumer borrowing? Craig Dismuke is chief economist at Vining Sparks, and he joins us to talk about that. I guess that is the question. What does this mean in terms of the health of the consumer?
Hey, well, good evening. I think the consumer is, when we look at it broadly, is very healthy right now. You look at their balance sheets, they've deleveraged quite a bit. You look at the labor market, obviously it's very healthy with the unemployment rate down to 4.3% now. And you see a little bit of earnings growth starting to pick up. And so we see the consumers being fairly stable right now. The uptick in defaults on credit cards is just fractional. The first quarter report showed an uptick to 7.4%, I believe it was. And that, when you look at it over the longer period, it still remains very low. So, we see the consumers being very healthy right now, despite the recent uptick in the credit card delinquency rates.
I think, Craig, I was supposed to feel good during Diana's report that mortgages may become easier for some people to get. At the same time, I heard her say that the people who are going to get those credit reports now may be able to pay up to 50% of their pre-tax income in debt payments. That sounds very, very high to me.
It reminds me of the early 2000s, actually, when we saw debt-to-income levels go up. The underwriting criteria were getting looser and looser. And so it's similar to that. It reminds me of that. And you're right. It makes me a little bit nervous as well. And remember, that's pre-tax income.
Right.
And it's also pre-insurance. And so when you're talking about spending 50% of your pre-tax, pre-insurance income on housing, that's a concern.
Mm-hmm. What else would be concerning to you? We started out talking about credit card defaults, which you made the point that historically is very low. At what point would that start to worry you?
If you see credit card delinquency rates jump up above 8-9%, I think that becomes a bigger concern. Credit card debt is still a fairly small component of overall debt, though. When you look at overall consumer debts, 68%, almost 70% of it comes from mortgages. Mortgages appear to be in fairly solid position right now. Consumers or homeowners have refinanced their mortgage rates down from 5.5% down to an average of 3.7% now. Going back over the past 7 years. So they're saving about $240 billion a month on mortgage interest payments. So, really when we look at credit, we see some positive things there. But if you were to see the default rates tick up on credit cards, that would be a concern. The other thing that's a concern, obviously, is the student loan market.
Right.
Student loans the default rate is over 11%. And that's been the biggest area of growth for consumer debt.
Craig, thank you very much. Craig Dismuke with Vining Sparks.
Thank you.
O'Reilly Automotive posts weaker than expected sales, and that is where we begin tonight's market focus. The auto parts retailer also said a mild winter caused customer spending to slow, resulting in same-store sales that missed the company's guidance and analyst estimates. O'Reilly said the miss will have an impact on its operating profitability. Shares of O'Reilly down nearly 19% at $178.77. And the disappointing results also sent shares of other auto parts retailers down, as you see right there. The apartment real estate investment trust Monogram Residential will be bought by the nation's largest apartment operator, Graystar Real Estate Partners. It's going to acquire Monogram for about $3 billion. Monogram up 21% on the news to $11.89. Goldman Sachs says it sees demand plateauing for Tesla's current products. The bank cut its 6-month price target on the automaker stock by nearly half, citing the company's lower than expected second quarter deliveries. Goldman also lowered its annual growth estimate for the Model S and X vehicles through 2021. Tesla down 7% today to $327 and change.
The graphics chipmaker Nvidia reached a deal with China's search engine Baidu to apply artificial intelligence to various applications. As part of the partnership, Baidu will use Nvidia's technology in its cloud computing and in its initiative to develop self-driving cars. Nvidia shares rose more than 2.5% to 143.05. Baidu added 2% to 183.83. And the U.S. credit card processor Vantiv said it reached a deal in principle to buy British rival WorldPay for about $10 billion. The proposed merger would give the new company greater access to brick-and-mortar and e-commerce businesses. Vantiv shares fell 2% to $61.02.
Mobile payments are changing the way we buy things, peer-to-peer lending changing the way businesses are financed. These financial innovations aren't just happening here, but also in China, reaching into remote areas of the country and potentially providing a new type of growth for the world's second largest economy. Eunice Yoon has our story.
Far from his posh Beijing office, Roger Ying is meeting some of his best clients.
We love coming down here. It's always a treat.
Stanford grad from South Africa founded a peer-to-peer lending company called Pandai. The P2P industry in China has run into financial trouble. To survive, Ying lends almost solely to people on the farms.
When I look at the China economy, there's 1.3 billion people. 300 to 400 million, the first and second tier cities, have already been enriched. There's 900 million other farmers who've been left behind by the mainstream financial system. Is that we see the unmet demand for farmers.
Farmers like the Fus. In the village of Jubao in southwest China, Fu Chengji used to be a coal miner. After getting injured, he wanted to try pig farming, but didn't have the money. In the countryside, it's hard to get money, he says. Even if I were to get a loan from the bank, it would be too small to start the business. Then the local village chief introduced him to Pandai. Pandai approved a loan of 80,000 yuan, more than $11,000. But rather than hand over cash, the company bought the pigs and feed. In 1 year, Fu expects to earn a profit of $14,500 after paying back the loan plus the 15.5% interest. This kind of lending may sound risky, lending to people on the farms who don't have much experience with modern finance. But in fact, Pandai says their recovery rate is 98.5%. And in a country where zombie companies may or may not pay their debt back, these farmers are a good bet.
The farmers, we find them to be very honest and very reliable and very basic people. And they are just looking to improve their own lives out of poverty.
That's what's happening to the Fus. I wanted to have a fridge and a TV when I got married, but we didn't have the money, Fu's wife says. Now we do. Good for an economy in need of new consumers for future growth. For Nightly Business Reports, I'm Eunice Yoon in Jubao Village.
Coming up, summer stinker, why most of the movies that were expected to be blockbusters are turning out to be busts. The jeans retailer True Religion is filing for bankruptcy protection. The company's financial struggles are due in part to changing consumer tastes and the shift away from shopping at department stores where True Religion jeans are primarily sold. The retailer said it is aiming to stay in business, though some stores will be closed.
The July 4th holiday, usually a sizzling time of year for movie-going, but not this year, not this weekend. And today, movie theater stocks traded lower. Julia Borston tells us why a summer slump appears to be taking hold in Hollywood.
The beach and barbecues burned the box office as the holiday weekend failed to turn around a weak summer so far. The season is now down about 9% from last year, pulling the year-to-date U.S. box office down nearly 1% from the year earlier, according to ComScore.
Holy moly!
Universal's Despicable Me 3 grossed $99 million in the U.S. in its first 5 days, but the $72 million it brought in over the weekend in the U.S. is about $10 million lower than the opening for Despicable Me 2. Another new release, Sony's Baby Driver, outperformed with a $21 million take. While Will Ferrell and Amy Poehler's comedy, The House from Warner Brothers, fell flat.
Oh, she adored her! Right now and over the past few weeks, there's only been a handful of movies that have really grabbed audiences and got them out from either, behind their TV or from the beach and gotten them in the theater this summer.
With the exception of Wonder Woman and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, every summer tentpole has underperformed expectations in North America. And the trend isn't expected to turn around anytime soon. Even with big films such as Sony's Spider-Man reboot opening Friday, MKM Partners warns that given tough comparisons for July and August, the third quarter box office will likely fall about 6%. And Morgan Stanley just slashed its price target on theater giant Regal on a lower box office forecast.
2, 1, go!
But for studios, even films that are suffering stateside are outperforming overseas.
And there's something going on here with international audiences where the novelty, the bombast, the epic size of these American-made movies are enough to get them in the theater and excited to go back over and over, whereas North American audiences seem much more jaded.
Internationally, Despicable Me 3 is off to a huge start, and even the fifth films in the Pirates of the Caribbean and Transformers franchises, though underperforming other sequels here in the U.S., have had a huge run overseas.
Good evening, Peter.
That increasingly powerful global audience is already impacting what movies Hollywood makes and where they're shot. We'll see how the upcoming Spider-Man and other big films, such as War for Planet of the Apes, perform overseas. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Julia Borston in Los Angeles.
And that's Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Sue Herrera. Thanks for joining us.
And thanks from me as well. I'm Tyler Mathisen. Have a great evening, everybody. We'll see you back here tomorrow night.